Next, we have India's eminent historian and biographer Ramachandra Guha, who presents the Indian Life series, where he attempts to fill the gaps between the time and truths of iconic Indian personalities. He is joined by three leading historians, Patrick Olivelle, Chitralekha Zutshi, and Nico Slate, who shed light on the life and legacy of leading Indian figures from their respective biographies.
Hi, I am Ramachandra Guha, and I'm the editor of the Indian Life series published by HarperCollins. And I'm delighted to be speaking to you today on the occasion of World Book Day. So I'll tell you a little bit about the series, how and why I conceived it, and what have been the fruits so far. So this series was thought up by me because of the mismatch between a growing popular demand for works of biography and the lack of scholars who are writing biographies on the other hand. If you want to approach history, it's much easier to approach it through the life of a remarkable individual whose struggles, whose anxieties, whose controversies, whose debates touches different parts of social, cultural, and political history. So the general reader wants to read about individual human beings and how they transformed history. But scholars hesitate from devoting 3 or 4 years to the life of a single individual. And this gap between a market for biographies and the absence of scholars to fulfill them has been filled by enterprising amateurs who are often charlatans, who write poorly researched, badly written, hagiographical, ideologically driven books. So I thought I must bridge this gap, and I persuaded 2 dozen of the world's finest scholars on India to contribute to this series. The first book, which appeared late last year, is this magnificent biography of the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka by Patrick Olivelle. Now, all of you know a little bit about Ashoka. So let me tell you about Patrick Olivelle. Patrick Olivelle is a Sri Lankan scholar, educated at Oxford, who has taught for many years in the United States. And he's a master of the ancient languages. So, Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit. He also knows Greek and Latin. And he has studied ancient India all his life. And he's written a series of superb works on law, politics, culture, family life, religion. And in many of these works, the remarkable yet enigmatic figure of Ashoka has somewhere been present. So I told Professor Olivelle, whom I know a little bit, I said, why did you write a book for this series on Ashoka? He said, I've never thought of writing a biography. We scholars have faced inhibitions about focusing on a single life, but let me try. And he produced this fabulous book. It's got, it's a book that is a rich, nuanced, subtle portrait of the Mughal emperor, of his life, the political context in which he worked, his religious philosophy, the impact he had, the legacy left behind, and paying particular attention to his words. Because Ashoka was, as Patrick Olivelle describes him, a philosopher king. He also wrote and expounded his philosophy of religious ecumenism, on nonviolence, and so on. And the book has got wonderful reviews all over India. It's been widely discussed and debated, and it's even been reviewed in the prestigious New Yorker magazine. That was our first book. We were off to a flying start. And then that was splendidly consolidated by book 2, which is the book on Sheikh Abdullah by the preeminent scholar of modern Kashmir, Chitralekha Zutshi. Now, unlike in the case of Professor Olivelle, whom I had to persuade to write on Ashoka, I knew that Professor Zutshi was writing on Sheikh Abdullah. Now, Sheikh Abdullah was born in the first decade of the 20th century, and he died in the 9th decade of the 20th century. So his life spanned that century. It impacted the lives of Kashmir, India, and Pakistan. His politics, his ideas, and his personal journey are absolutely central to the conflict over Kashmir between India and Pakistan. He embodies the complicated, anguished, troubled, and still unfinished story of Kashmir. So I asked Professor Zutshi whether she would give me her book for this series, because I knew she was working on this life of Sheikh Abdullah, and to my great pleasure, she agreed. And the book is out, and like Olivelle's Ashoka, has been getting very fine, appreciative reviews. Now, one thing I'd say about the book on Sheikh Abdullah, which links it to how I began, how the general reader wants to read biographies, and scholars must supply this need. Supposing, instead of calling it Sheikh Abdullah, the caged lion of Kashmir, Professor Zutshi had titled her book, The Modern Political History of Modern Kashmir, or Modern Political History of Kashmir. It would have attracted far less attention. But through this individual, whose life is in fact central to that modern political history, you can draw the reader into much larger issues beyond a single life. So that was book 2. Book 3, which just appeared a few weeks ago, is a biography of Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, subtitled The Art of Freedom, written by the brilliant young American historian Nico Slate. Now, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay has strong claims to being the most extraordinary woman in modern Indian history. In fact, in my personal pantheon, she's there with Gandhi, Ambedkar, and Tagore as a remarkable, multifaceted, transformative individual. You know, she was born like Sheikh Abdullah in the first decade of the 20th century. She lived like Sheikh Abdullah again until the last penultimate decade of the 20th century. She had a very colorful and interesting life. She was born in the coastal parts of what is now Karnataka. She was widowed early. She had arranged marriage. She was widowed early, but her mother encouraged her to study. So she went to Madras to study, where she got involved in theater and in feminist politics. And she was the first Indian woman ever to stand for an election in 1926, in a local election in Madras. Then she got involved in the freedom struggle. She persuaded Gandhi to allow women to join the Salt March. Gandhi was hesitant, but Kamala Devi prevailed. She went to jail in the 30s, again in the 40s. She helped start the Indian socialist movement. After partition, she refused her job in Nehru's cabinet to resettle refugees, and the town of Faridabad outside Delhi was partly built because of her pioneering efforts. Then she turned her attention to reviving India's rich but neglected handicrafts tradition. And those of you who live in Delhi or visited Delhi may have gone to the Cottage Industries Emporium in Janpath or to the Crafts Museum, Purana Khila. Both are there because of Kamala Devi. So she revived, renewed crafts traditions all over India through the cooperative movement, got craftspeople a market, dignity, self-respect. And as if this was not enough, as if her political, social reform, social activism, feminism in India was not enough, she also had a profound international impact. In the 1930s, as a young woman in her 30s, an Indian woman in those days, when the world was not interconnected or globalized, she traveled in the American South and campaigned against racism. And she brought the ideas of Satyagraha and Gandhian nonviolence to the American South, where 2 decades later, after Kamala Devi traveled through those parts of southern United States, Martin Luther King was to launch his civil rights struggle inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. She also visited China, Japan. She was very active in the international crafts movement. So she had an extraordinarily rich and multifaceted life. And Nico Slate had been interested in Kamala Devi from the time of his own first book, which was a history of the connections between the American civil rights struggle and the Indian nationalist movement. So I asked him to write a book for my series, and he's produced a superb work. So we started with these 3 books. I'll just show them to you again. Patrick Olivell's Ashoka, Chitralekha Zutshi's Sheikh Abdullah, and Nico Slate's Kamala Devi. And now our hope, which I'm sure we will fulfill, is that over the next decade, every year we'll produce 1 or 2 books. Now, it's very important for me as a scholar to adhere to a certain rigor and quality. As I said in the beginning, I don't want hagiography, I don't want polemics, I don't want books written with a political agenda. I want richly researched, subtly argued, and elegantly written lives of remarkable individuals. And so far, we have got 3 of these. The other books in the series that will come, and I'll just give you a glimpse of some of the books that will appear in the forthcoming years, are Akshay Mukul, well-known historian and biographer based in Delhi, who's writing on the remarkable Jayaprakash Narayan; Aparna Kapadia, a leading historian of modern Gujarat, who's writing on Kasturba Gandhi's Gandhi's unfairly condescended to and occasionally forgotten wife. Srinath Raghavan, India's foremost modern historian of his generation, is writing a biography of the great astrophysicist Subramaniam Chandrasekhar, who was also one of the first Indians to make it in America. Abhishek Kekar, a very gifted and talented historian of late Mughal India, is writing on the Mughal diarist and scholar Anand Ram Mukhlis, through whose life one can, through whose life and writings unfolds the rich tapestry of what Delhi, 18th century Delhi was. Then we have Harish Damodaran, a senior journalist with the Indian Express and the author of two well-acclaimed books already, writing a life of Ramkrishna Dalmia, who was a buccaneering media magnate, entrepreneur, a sort of Ambani or Adani of his day. Then we have Prashant Kidambi, well-known historian of modern India or modern Maharashtra, writing what will be, I am sure, will be the first serious, rigorous biography of the remarkable Bal Gangadhar Tilak, a great icon of our freedom struggle, who has not really got his due from historians and biographers. Finally, one last example of the books that are forthcoming in the series, the great American scholar of religion, Richard Davis, whose books include a wonderful biography of the Bhagavad Gita, is writing for the Indian Life series on the Chola Emperor, Raja Chola. So this will give you a sense of the kinds of books that will appear in the Indian Life series over the next decade or so. Meanwhile, I hope you will go and savor these books that have already appeared, Ashoka, Sheikh Abdullah, and finally, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay.
Good morning or good evening, wherever you happen to be. My name is Patrick Olivelle, and I'm today talking about my new book, Ashoka, Portrait of a Philosopher King. I'm glad that this video will come out on the World Book Day and as part of the India Lives series published by HarperCollins and edited by Dr. Ramachandra Guha. The book that I wrote started during the pandemic. So it had a very interesting history where I was isolated with my wife in my house. And fortunately, because of modern technology, I was able to access most of the literature that I needed to write the book. The book is about King Ashoka, the 3rd century BCE emperor who ruled over much of what is today India or the Indian subcontinent. My book is different from many of the books written about Ashoka in that I focus exclusively or almost exclusively on his own writings that are preserved for us in exactly the same way that it was written because they were inscribed on stone pillars and on rocks. So my focus has been on Ashoka's own words. And I don't call this a biography because we don't have the data that is normally required to write a biography of a person. But I've called it a portrait because I want his own words, Ashoka's own words, to reveal the person behind those words. So I'm trying to draw a portrait of this interesting man who lived probably before his times, and present to the reader this complicated and colorful personality of King Ashoka. I deal with this in 4 parts of the book. The first one deals with the main identity of Ashoka, that is as king and ruler. He ruled over a vast empire, which was multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multilingual. The second part deals with the second persona, the second identity of Ashoka, and that is Ashoka as a Buddhist. In his very first writing, which we called Minor Rock Inscription 1, he openly says that he was a Buddhist, and he uses the technical term Upasaka to refer to himself, a committed, loyal Buddhist. The third part, which is possibly the most central in the book, I deal with Ashoka as a moral philosopher. Soon after his conversion to Buddhism, Ashoka thought better of what he was trying to do, and he thought that he would do something different from being purely a Buddhist. He thought that he would try to create a new moral philosophy that could be followed by anybody, whatever religion that person may belong to. This moral philosophy, he anchored in the central term, dharma. Dharma for Ashoka was a moral principle that human beings, whether they were Buddhist monks, Brahmins, laypersons, rich, poor, men, women, they all could follow. And in most of his writings, both the rock inscriptions and the pillar inscriptions, he tried to explicate, to define what he means by dharma and his new moral philosophy. The fourth part deals with how Ashoka dealt with the multiple religions that people followed during his time. These religions, he used the term Pashanda. Pashanda, in later Sanskrit and other Indian languages, have a pejorative meaning. It defines the other, the bad persons. On the other hand, for Ashoka, it was merely a classificatory term. Classifies people into the religions that they followed. In his pillar inscriptions, he talks about 4 such Pashandas: the Buddhists, the Jains, the Ajivikas, and the Brahmins. And in this part, I call Ashoka the ecumenist. Ecumenism is a modern term that deals with the ability or the intent of people to go beyond their own religion and to establish ways of communicating, ways of cooperating with people of other religions. And this is what Ashoka does. Ashoka wanted all his Pashandas, whether they were monks and ascetics, or whether they were stay-at-home householders, to follow the ecumenical path of learning from each other, talking to each other, and of course, being nice to each other. This is the part I think that will be most relevant for modern people, whether in India or elsewhere, that we live today in a world that is multi-everything. You have nations, you have religions, you have languages, you have political parties, you have a variety of identities that people have today. And Ashoka invites them to rise beyond those narrow identities, to rise to a level where they can not only talk to, be cooperative with, but also learn from others. He uses the term Bahu Shruta, which in Sanskrit means much heard, and Shruta means hearing as well as learning. So a well-educated, much learned person is called Bahu Shruta. But he uses the term Shruta, which has 2 meanings, learning as well as hearing, to say that you cannot be a Bahu Shruta, you cannot be learned if you are listening only to yourself. You have to listen to others, You have to learn from others. And I think that is one of the major features of Ashoka that is relevant throughout the centuries, but especially, I think, in the modern world, when means of communications are so fast that people, I'm here in Austin, Texas, in the United States, and I can pick up the phone and talk to somebody in Delhi. This kind of facility of communication that was not even there when I was a young man makes it even more imperative that we talk to each other, that we don't only scream at each other, that we are able to appreciate what other people are, what they think, and what they have to say. And I think that will be the central message that my book hopes to convey to the modern reader. Thank you very much.
Start.
Hi everyone, I'm Chitralekha Zutshi. I'm the author of Sheikh Abdullah, the Caged Lion of Kashmir, which was recently published by HarperCollins in its Indian Live series. And I want to wish all of you happy World Book Day and tell you a little bit about the process of writing this book and how it all came together. So I'm a historian of Kashmir, and Sheikh Abdullah, of course, looms large in the history of Kashmir. He is a very important political figure who shaped Kashmir's political life. And I would say that he even shaped India's political life as well. After India became independent in 1947, and his legacy is deeply contested in the Indian subcontinent. So he's remembered in different ways by different generations of Kashmiris and of Indians. So starting with, say, the older generation remembers Sheikh Abdullah with fondness for having orchestrated the political movement that freed Kashmiris from the exploitation of the Dogra regime under which they lived for at least a century. And the next generation after that, that was born in the 1950s, has a more complicated relationship with Sheikh Abdullah's image and his legacy, because they really looked up to him as the founder of Kashmiri nationalism. But in 1975, he made a pact and an accord with the Indian government that they see as a betrayal of their dreams of self-determination. The younger generation that is now in Kashmir knows very little about Sheikh Abdullah, and whatever they do know is filtered through this lens of their parents' generation that doesn't remember him with very much fondness. So they think of him also as some sort of a traitor to their cause. But there are certain legacies of Sheikh Abdullah that have stood the test of time. So for instance, he carried out land reforms, his government carried out land reforms in the early 1950s. And those things are still hailed as being progressive and important for the life of Kashmiris. In India and Pakistan, again, Sheikh Abdullah's legacy is kind of contested, because in India, either Sheikh Abdullah is seen as being sort of a champion of secular nationalism, as a result of which he aligned with India in 1947, or he's seen as a traitor to India for championing Kashmiri self-determination in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. In Pakistan, again, when Sheikh Abdullah signed or gave his acceptance to the accord, to the accession of Kashmir to India in 1947, he was seen as a traitor to Pakistan. He was seen as someone who had sold the Kashmiris out. But once he was arrested in 1953 and he was removed from office as a result, Pakistanis or the Pakistani state began to put him forward as a champion of Kashmiri self-determination. So as you can see, Sheikh Abdullah is a very complicated figure. So what I wanted to do in this book is engage with some of these legacies to see how they came about and how Sheikh Abdullah himself engaged with these legacies and or not so much legacies, but these images and labels that he was given by essentially putting him in a much broader context, right? So as a historian, I'm trained to think broadly about social and political processes. But here I had an individual that I had to write, whose life I had to narrate. So what I did was I placed this individual in these broader contexts and allowed his life to shed light on these broader political and social processes of the coming of age of India as a state, for instance, after 1947, of the shaping of anti-colonial nationalism and its relationships with regions, of global phenomena such as communism, socialism, federalism, and secularism, and how they impacted Kashmir and the Indian subcontinent, all through the prism of this one life. Now, I began working on this biography in earnest about 10 years ago. I was in India doing research on it with the private papers at the Nehru Memorial Library. And of course, I was all over Kashmir and Jammu, Bombay, Delhi, Jaipur, places where I could find people who had had some relationship with Sheikh Abdullah or who remembered him just as ordinary people. And of course, I was also looking for documents and such. So I began working on this biography. And, at some point, Ramachandra Guha, who's the editor of the Indian Life series, found out that I was working on the biography, and he contacted me and asked me if I would like to include it in the Indian Life series with HarperCollins. And I was very pleased about that because Ram Guha, of course, is a doyen of biographical writing. And I was excited that he was going to be able to guide me through the process of narrating this life. I completed my research in about 5 years for the biography. As I said, it was a very complicated process. It was not easy to access documents. Sheikh Abdullah is not left behind very much writing. So it wasn't like I could draw on his published writing. So I had to go almost door to door in Kashmir and Jammu, Delhi, Bombay to ask for people for documents. And I also worked with the private papers of many individuals, as I said, in the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. And oral narratives were very important for me as well in this book. So I conducted interviews with many people across the region. And what I found most revealing was just ordinary people talking about Sheikh Abdullah and how he had impacted their lives and their vision for Kashmir and for the Indian subcontinent. But of course, there were also very important people such as his colleagues like G.M. Bakshi or Sadiq, all of these, Muhammad Afzal Beg, all of these people who were around him. There were, of course, also people who were his critics and other kinds of interlocutors whose oral narratives and private papers I was able to access. And all of this allowed me to stitch together this tapestry, a very complex tapestry of this one very contested life. I finished the book. I've actually started writing the book about 5 years ago. I finished it in 5 years. And once I was done with the first draft, Ram Guha read the entire thing and, kind of made his very astute comments, which allowed me to frame the book in a more interesting and complex fashion. And the end result, of course, is this book that I hope you will all get to read, because by reading it, what you will discover is not just the story of this one complicated man's life, but the story of the becoming of India itself after 1947. You will discover how India chose some of the ideas that became central to its identity and its institutional structure, such as, for instance, federalism and secularism, and how an interaction between Kashmir through Sheikh Abdullah and India really brought these ideas into focus and shaped and reshaped them. And I want to wish you at the very end happy reading and enjoy.
Hello, friends and readers. Happy World Book Day. My name is Nico Slate. I am a professor and the department chair in the Department of History at Carnegie Mellon University in Pennsylvania. And it's my great pleasure to speak about my contribution to the Indian Lives series, which is a biography of Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay entitled Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, The Art of Freedom. My hunch is that many of you are at least somewhat familiar with Kamaladevi, but what's so remarkable about her life is that she had a variety of different key contributions to the history of the Indian freedom struggle and indeed to freedom struggles throughout the world. And so it's very possible that some of you might, for example, be familiar with Kamaladevi's incredibly important contributions to the history of art and crafts in India, whereas others might see Kamaladevi primarily through the lens of Indian women's activism, and still others might see her through her very important work with refugees in the aftermath of partition. So what I'd like to do in order to introduce my book and Kamaladevi's life is to walk through the key moments in her life in order to demonstrate both her significance and the significance of her legacy, and also hopefully to show how the different facets of her life were interconnected. Because part of what I found most moving in writing about Kamaladevi's life is recognizing the ways that she herself, her own life, and in her activism, fought against any kind of division or separation between the different causes that she believed in. If there's one thing that I take from Kamaladevi's life, it's the importance of looking across borders, nations, of religions or ethnicities or languages or any other way that we tend to divide up the human race. Kamaladevi looked across those in order to envision a better world for everyone and to fight against multiple forms of injustice. And you see that in her political work, and you also see it in personal life. So let's begin at the beginning. Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay was born in the city, at that point it was still a relatively small city of Mangalore, not too long after the turn of the 20th century. She was born into a relatively well-off Chitrapur Saraswat family, but early on in her life, her family went through quite a crisis when her father passed away. And because of the gendered inheritance norms of that time and place, she and her mother ended up inheriting much less of the family's wealth than they would otherwise. And so from a very early age, Kamaladevi was forced to grapple with the profound inequities of sex and gender in colonial India, and in fact throughout most of the world at that particular point in time. Her mother responded to this calamity by focusing on Kamaladevi's education, but also by agreeing to have Kamaladevi married at a very early age. And the historical record isn't precise about this, but somewhere around age of 11 or 12, Kamaladevi is married, which again was typical of people in her caste and class and at that particular moment in time. But within about a year of that marriage, Kamaladevi's new husband passes away. And at this point, this is where Kamaladevi's story becomes quite unusual, because it would have been expected for someone of her class and caste status that she would live a life of relative ascetic seclusion as a child widow. But instead, Kamaladevi, with the support of her mother, and in fact also the support of the boy's father, continues to pursue her education, and as a teenager moves with her mother to the much larger city of what was then known as Madras, of course today Chennai. And it's in, again, Chennai, or what was then Madras, that Kamaladevi is able to break free of the usual constraints that would be imposed on a child widow. And she both advances her own education and meets her second husband. And this is another point of transgression on Kamaladevi's behalf and on her family's behalf. It's unusual for a child widow to have the sorts of freedom that Kamaladevi had, and it was extremely unusual for someone to remarry. Kamaladevi marries across the lines of community and language and region. She marries to the very prominent Chattopadhyay family, originally from Bengal, but they had lived in a variety of other places. And she marries an incredibly dynamic, but also ultimately troubled figure, who is a poet and an actor and a very dynamic figure. And at first, Kamaladevi is deeply in love with him, but over time, the relationship becomes very troubled because Kamaladevi's husband has a series of affairs with other women, and is a very predictable figure who, when he's there, can be a loving father to their son, but often goes away for long periods of time and is not responsible in the way one would hope from a parent. So as a young person, Kamaladevi is struggling with balancing this unpredictable relationship and also trying to figure out for herself what her own vocation in the world is. She follows her second husband to the UK, where she studies sociology and becomes increasingly committed to fighting to make the world a better place. When she comes back to India, she joins the Gandhian nonviolent struggle, but is even from that point in time not a complete devotee to the cause of nonviolence. So she believes in fighting against British imperialism, and she recognizes the pragmatic utility of nonviolence, but she hasn't fully embraced it as a philosophical principle in the way that Gandhi himself did. She also commits herself to the struggle against sexism and patriarchy and becomes one of the first Indian women to run for a position in a provincial government. She ultimately loses that electoral race, but just the fact that she runs there's tremendous amounts of interest amongst other progressive actors, particularly women's advocates. And Kamaladevi is then asked to serve as the founding secretary in the creation of the All India Women's Conference, the AIUC, which emerges as the most important women's organization in colonial India and remains that for decades. And Kamaladevi plays a key role in the founding and the creation of that organization. She travels around India, encouraging other women to join and also encouraging to make the most of their leverage in order to advance the cause of women's liberation, but also the cause of freedom from British rule, and also a variety of other causes against discriminations of caste or class. Even from an early age, Kamaladevi's vision is quite inclusive in terms of how she understands her struggle. She's fighting against British rule. She's fighting to create the All India Women's Conference and to make it become as effective or powerful an organization as it could become. And she's also, with her husband, advancing her own artistic career. She is performing in plays, and she'll also perform in a few early films. This is quite a bold move on her part, because for an upper caste woman to act on the stage or to act on the cinema was seen as quite scandalous. But she did it anyway. She did it in part because she believed in the efficacy of these forms of communication, means to stir people to take action on the political scene. But she also did it because she loved art from an early age. She loved drama, she loved the stage, she loved art of a variety of kinds, and she wanted to express her own creativity in the creation of beauty. So she's got this political career, she's got this artistic career. She's also trying to raise a son with a husband who, as I said, is often very difficult and not always present. And she's trying to balance all of these things. And yet, remarkably, she also refuses to be bound by the borders of India. She also is committed to bringing the causes and struggles that she believes in abroad. And she travels abroad, going to Europe, for example, visiting a variety of different countries in Europe, going to present-day Sri Lanka, what was then Ceylon. And wherever she goes, she continues to advocate a variety of causes. So when she's meeting with anti-colonial figures, she reminds them also pay attention to the struggles of women. Many European women who oppose sexism and patriarchy, but are perfectly fine with imperialism and with white supremacy, indeed. And Kamala will have none of that. She's very pointed in criticizing the limitations of European women and American women who often use the inequities of sex and gender as an excuse for British rule in India. She pushes back hard and says, no, we want to ensure freedom for women, but we also want to ensure freedom for all Indians as well. So she's balancing a variety of struggles, both within her own home and on the political stage, while advancing her own artistic career. And then comes the Salt Satyagraha of 1930, one of Gandhi's most renowned political campaigns, and as I expect many of those listening know, a campaign that starts with a very limited conception of who should be involved in nonviolent disobedience. When Gandhi launches this march from his ashram, he recruits a select group of fellow activists, satyagrahis, and they're all men. And there are a variety of women who protest this, but Kamala Devi is one of the most vocal and, in fact, just goes to the march and challenges Gandhi in person and argues quite forcefully that his own conception of nonviolence and the power of nonviolence was predicated on the ability of people across genders and different identities to participate in the struggle. And Kamala Devi refuses to allow the struggle to be limited on of sex. And Gandhi agrees. To his credit, he is convinced to open up the Salt Satyagraha fully to all men and women to participate on equal grounds. And that is, in fact, what Kamala Devi herself does. She joins the struggle and becomes one of its leaders in Mumbai, then Bombay, and participates in a range of illegal activities in the cause of challenging British rule. Eventually, she's put into jail. And she spends, this is actually not the first time she's been in a British jail, and it won't be the last either. She repeatedly goes to jail in the cause of India's freedom. While she's in jail, she recognizes the importance of class and class inequity, because even though political prisoners are often separated, and Kamala Devi herself was separated during this particular period in jail, she also has the experience when imprisoned at various junctures of coming into touch with poor and working class women who've been imprisoned for other reasons. And she learns from those women something that she'd already experienced as a child, she'd already seen, but it deepens in her a recognition of the profound inequities of poverty in colonial India, and in fact throughout the world, the profound inequities that still continue to our world today, in which certain people have vastly more wealth than they need, and others don't have any food to eat or shelter. And class becomes an increasingly important part of Kamala Devi's vision of her activism. And in the wake of the Salt Satyagraha, she's one of the founding figures in the Congress Socialist Party, which is a very important organization of progressive figures who want to impose British rule, but are also deeply concerned with the inequities of class within colonial India. Unlike the communists at this point, the Congress Socialists are interested in working with the larger, broader freedom struggle in order to end British rule. And they're also, in general, the variety there, but in general, they're deeply concerned by authoritarianism and are interested in advancing a form of socialism that is democratic, both internally and externally. Kamala Devi will remain a committed socialist to one degree or another for the rest of her life. It remains very important to her throughout the 30s, 40s, and into the 50s. And what she understands as socialism is always, I think, something of a balance between a firm commitment to ending class inequity, but also a belief in democratic freedoms and freedom of speech, freedom of association. So she remains a staunch critic of the sort of harsh capitalism that she sees in the United States, for example, but is also a critic of the Soviet Union for its freedom of speech and of other political norms. Well, Kamaladevi is committed to the Congress Socialist Party and remains an active socialist throughout the rest of her time in India, but it doesn't cut her off from Gandhi and the larger freedom struggle. And in the late 1940s, she becomes a key figure in the wake of partition, helping refugees. That's another key part of this book. And then finally, the last important section of the book, which is, in fact, the part of Kamaladevi's life for which she's most often known in India today, is looking at her very important work supporting craftspeople and artisans across India and, in fact, abroad. She's one of the key players in the development of crafts and artists within India today. And tying all of these different strands together, my key argument is that Kamaladevi believes in fighting for justice across many divides, and that her life reminds us of the power of believing in oneself and believing in one's connection with people in the struggle for a better world. Thank you.